Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. Today we're continuing on in our series called The Super Cool Stories of the Bible, where we're looking at different stories and the lessons that we can learn from them. And today we're looking at the story of David and Jonathan. Now, this super cool story actually begins on the day that David killed Goliath. If you're not familiar with that story, Goliath was a literal giant that stood well over 10.5 feet tall and weighed well over 600 pounds in his armor. He was a Philistine warrior, and he had been challenging the Israelite army for 40 days, asking them to send out a delegate to fight him. And everybody had been watching this and refusing to do so, including the Israelite king named Saul. Then David shows up, who was a teenager, probably weighing less than 200 pounds and had no armor. And of course, if you know the story, he defeats Goliath in dramatic fashion because he was defaming the name of God. And everybody watched this happen, including Saul, all of his commanders, and his son Jonathan. And in fact, look at what we're told happened right after this. 1 Samuel 17. As soon as David returned from killing Goliath, Abner brought him to Saul with the Philistine's head still in his hand. "Tell me about your father, young man," Saul said. And David replied, "His name is Jesse, and we live in Bethlehem." After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. As you can imagine, David's victory over Goliath had a massive impact on his social popularity, meaning he went from being a nobody to being a somebody / a hero of all of Israel in one day. But this did not go to David's head, meaning he didn't get all arrogant and cocky and proud about it. And the reason why is he understood that he was just a tool in God's powerful hand. He recognized that God was the one who deserved all the credit. Or in other words, David was humble, which leads us to lesson number 1 in this story, which is humility in success is attractive. And in lots of different ways. For instance, we can see that Saul from that point on wanted to keep David with him. And why wouldn't he? I mean, if I were the ultimate king and military commander of all of Israel, I would certainly want to have a young, humble giant slayer around me. But also we see that David was attractive in his humility in success to Jonathan, Saul's son, who was probably about the same age as David was at about that time. And that we're told that he loved him particularly like himself, which leads us to the next lesson in this story, which is Jonathan's love was godly. Meaning there are no sexual innuendos being made in this story, or there are no references that Jonathan was sexually attracted to David, as some have implied. No, the Bible is very clear. Again, we are told that Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. And this was ultimately the command that God had given to all followers of the Old Testament. Everybody, not just Jonathan. And the religious experts, particularly in Jesus' day, not only knew this, they taught this. The problem is they didn't live up to this. And so one day when a religious expert was questioning Jesus and challenging him about his wisdom and intellect about the things of God, Jesus schooled him with a story, and the story that he went on to tell them was the story of the Good Samaritan. But look at what it is that this religious expert admitted to in terms of what it is that God wanted from everyone. Luke 10:25. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him, "do this and you will live." The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" God has always wanted us, as followers, to love others as we love ourselves. And Jesus was helping this religious expert to understand that he was not living up to that command, like what Jonathan was. So keep that in mind when you think about the story of David and Jonathan. This was a godly love, the kind of love that God has always been asking all of his followers to have for everybody. For everybody. Now, the thing that I think is really indicative of this love, which is very interesting about this, is that early on in this relationship, Jonathan proved this love when he gave David his royal clothing and his royal weapons. Which leads us to the next lesson in this story, which is actions demonstrate genuine love. You see, because Jonathan was in line for the throne, there may have been some sort of a conversation where he said to David, hey, bro, listen, man, I love you, and I don't care if all of Judah and Israel want you as their next king. I'm totally cool with that. But actions demonstrate that kind of genuine love, and so that's why he may have given over those royal belongings, the robes and the weapons, to demonstrate for him that he genuinely did love him and that he was totally okay with David taking on that position as the next leader, ruler, king of all of Israel. And one of the reasons why David was perhaps so easy to love, besides his humility and success, was that people could see that God was clearly with David and that David had a super close relationship with God. This is also attractive for some, like with Jonathan, but in the situation with Saul, he was actually intimidated by this and afraid of this. For instance, look at what we're told happened next. 1 Samuel 18. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. This made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands? Next they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp, as he did each day. But Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. Saul then was afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. Finally, Saul sent him away and appointed him commander over 1,000 men, and David faithfully led his troops into battle. David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. When Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was so successful at leading his troops into battle. Perhaps you picked up on the fact that Saul wanted Israel and Judah to have success in battles, but he wanted the glory and the credit for himself, unlike David, who was totally willing to give all of the credit to God. This leads us to the next lesson in this story, which is God humbles the proud. Meaning, when you and I find ourselves in positions of leadership, the last thing that we should be doing is peacocking about like Nebuchadnezzar, if you know that story or remember it, or getting jealous of others when we see God using them, like in the situation with Saul. All of those things are just driven by pride. Now, for those of you who know the New Testament, you know that all of the apostles, especially Peter, was really driven by pride. And they would argue amongst themselves all the time about who was the greatest amongst them. In fact, all of them, based primarily on ethnicity, believed that Jesus was going to eliminate or eradicate Rome and once again establish the Jews as a nation into that position. But that's not what God's plan was, clearly. And in the process, what God did with Peter and the rest of them is he humbled them greatly and showed them that in the invitation to be a leader within his kingdom, that it was totally different than what they were thinking. In fact, look at what it is that Peter went on to say to everybody within the church about humility. 1 Peter 5. And now a word to you who are elders in the church. I too am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, and I too will share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you. Care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. In the same way, you who are younger must accept the authority of the elders. And all of you dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, he will lift you up in honor. Saul was anything but humble, and so God was trying to humble him. But unlike in the situation with Peter and the apostles, Saul didn't change. He continued to rebel, and his hatred and his fear and his anger toward David continued, and it escalated, and it led him to making some horrible choices and decisions. For instance, every year at the New Moon Festival/feast, David would attend, along with all of Saul's court, his commanders, this ongoing dinner for a series of days. But David knew that Saul was trying to kill him, and Jonathan wasn't convinced. And so they made up this little story, this little plan. David was going to hide in a field for a few days, and Jonathan was going to tell Saul that David needed to go back to Bethlehem to attend to some family stuff. If Saul got angry, then David was right. Saul was waiting to kill David. But if Saul didn't get angry when he heard the news of David not being there, then Jonathan was right. Everything was safe. So this was the plan that they had made up. And this is what happened. 1 Samuel 20. So David hid himself in the field, and when the new moon festival began, the king sat down to eat. He sat at his usual place against the wall, with Jonathan sitting opposite him and Abner beside him. But David's place was empty. Saul didn't see anything about it that day, for he had said to himself, "Something must have made David ceremonially unclean." But when David's place was empty again the next day, Saul asked Jonathan, "Why hasn't the son of Jesse been here for the meal either yesterday or today?" Jonathan replied, "David earnestly asked me if he could go to Bethlehem. He said, 'Please let me go, for we are having a family sacrifice. My brother demanded that I be there. So please let me get away to see my brothers.' That's why he isn't here at the king's table." Saul boiled with rage at Jonathan. "You stupid son of a whore!" he swore at him. "Do you think I don't know that you want him to be king in your place, shaming yourself and your mother? As long as that son of Jesse is alive, you'll never be king. Now go and get him so I can kill him." "But why should he be put to death?" Jonathan asked his father. "What has he done?" Then Saul hurled his spear at Jonathan, intending to kill him. So at last Jonathan realized that his father was really determined to kill David. Jonathan left the table in fierce anger and refused to eat on that second day of the festival, for he was crushed by his father's shameful behavior toward David. The next morning, as agreed, Jonathan went out into the field and took a young boy with him to gather his arrows. "Start running," he told the boy, "so you can find the arrows as soon as I shoot them." So the boy ran, and Jonathan shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy had almost reached the arrow, Jonathan shouted, "The arrow is still ahead of you! Hurry, hurry! Don't wait!" So the boy quickly gathered up the arrows and ran back to his master. He, of course, suspected nothing. Only Jonathan and David understood the signal. Then Jonathan gave his bow and arrows to the boy and told him to take them back to town. As soon as the boy was gone, David came out from where he had been hiding near the stone pile. Then David bowed 3 times to Jonathan with his face to the ground. Both of them were in tears as they embraced each other and said goodbye, especially David. At last, Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn loyalty to each other in the Lord's name. The Lord is the witness of a bond between us and our children forever." Then David left, and Jonathan returned to the town. This was the last time that Jonathan and David got to see one another up close and personal anyway. You see, right after this, Saul had 85 priests slaughtered and killed simply because they helped David escape. And this led to Saul's death at the hands of the Philistines. And not only his death, but Jonathan's death and some of his other sons. And as a result of this, it paved the way, as many of you know, for David to become the next king of not only Israel and of Judah. But none of this would have happened if it weren't for Jonathan and what it is that he did, which brings us to the last lesson in this story, which is there's no success without sacrifice. And I think everyone knows that in order to be successful, we have to have some sacrifices along the way. Yes, they're the sacrifices that we make personally. And we can see that in this story that David certainly made lots of sacrifices. He didn't get to spend time with his family or go back to do those things. And obviously being responsible for lots of other people as a leader means you're making a lot of personal sacrifices to take care of them. Just like what Peter was talking about. All of those things are sacrifices. But in this story, maybe one of the greatest lessons that we can learn is the sacrifices that are made by others. For instance, like a Jonathan. And remember this truth. As followers, God has not called every single one of us to be kings. but he has called every single one of us to be Jonathans and to love others as we love ourselves and to be willing to give up that position of the throne for somebody else.